Good afternoon. We're here with Senator David Leyonhjelm to follow up on his appearance on Q&A on Monday night. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you.
On Monday night you appeared on Q&A where some important issues were raised. As always, there's never enough time to fully explore all the issues during the program, and many people want to clearly hear more about these issues from a libertarian perspective. So that's the theme of today's Facebook Live. If you have questions on other issues, we'd appreciate if we'll deal with those in another session. So, Senator, the NDIS was discussed extensively on Q&A by those who are highly supportive of the program. However, you are on the record of saying that it could be a financial wrecking ball. What is the key point about the NDIS that you would like people to focus on?
Well, I guess the first starting point is even in a libertarian society, in a perfect world, we would care for the disabled, the genuinely disabled. We would do it on a voluntary basis rather than via the government, but we would definitely care for the disabled. In our society, in modern democracies, we have taxation money being used for purposes that might go to private purposes in a different context. The NDIS is one of those, unemployment benefits, welfare of other kinds, age pensions, those sorts of things. They're also examples of using the government or having the government intervene and intrude and take our taxes and use it for a purpose that we probably would have contributed to as private individuals anyway. That being the case, there are obviously some issues about the NDIS we need to be very mindful of. The most important thing is to ensure that only those who are genuinely needy receive the money. Well, in fact, they don't receive money, they receive a package of funds which they can't access directly, but which can be used to pay for services to allow them to participate in a non-disabled world on a relatively normal basis. And that makes a certain amount of sense. The issue, of course, is what's the definition of disabled? As it stands, as the NDIS is being implemented by each state with agreement with the Commonwealth Government, it's becoming obvious that it is a massive, great trough of money, and every snout in the country is quivering at the anticipation of getting into that money trough. And a good example of where that might be heading is the discussions around inclusion of mental illness, mental disability in qualifying for a package under the NDIS. Now, the good thing about the NDIS is that it does treat the disabled individuals as the customer. So the customer gets the package and then they can pick and choose who their supplier is. That's a good starting point for any program. I think it could be applied to education and health more generally. But once you start including mental illness, then the question is, well, what is mental illness? What is mental disability? Just to show you how frivolous it can get, a friend of mine a week or two back said, well, look, and it was obviously a joke, but I feel suicidal if I can't go and shopping for jewellery and furs. Obviously, suicidal thoughts can be construed as a mental illness. So should the NDIS provide for someone to take this friend of mine shopping to buy jewellery and furs? It kind of highlights that it has fairly ludicrous potential if you don't draw a line under it. So, broadly speaking, the way we would analyse it in a libertarian context is to say, well, let's take the government out of it. What would we do? What conditions would we place on using our money as generous benefactors to disabled people and allow them to participate in the able-bodied world as normally as they possibly can? What conditions would we as donors put on that money? And if the government is being more generous than what we would be if we were donating that money in a private capacity, then we have to say, hey, that's going too far. The government is not entitled to give away our money more generously than we would give away our money if we were doing it one-on-one.
So Charles posts the question on Facebook, why have the NDIS at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a Labor program, and it originated out of the perception that the disabled were not being well cared for under a multitude of state programs. You know, was that true? It's arguable. In some cases it was true. It's also not the case for all disabled or even a majority of disabled. So my feeling is the arguments for having the NDIS in the first place weren't very well founded, and if I had my choice, if there was any way I could do it, the NDIS would either be abolished or seriously changed. That's not going to happen though, of course, so what we have to do is make the best of it. And as I said, the fact that it does treat the disabled individuals as customers with suppliers competing for their business is a good step forward, so hopefully other programs will benefit from that. But we do have to be careful that it just doesn't become an endless, bottomless pit of money into which all the snouts you can imagine are sticking there, poking into.
Okay, thank you. On Monday, further discussion on the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement and renewable energy was cut short due to time constraints. Anthony Albanese and Karuna Stamel were highly supportive of renewable energy. Your view is more nuanced. Why is that?
I don't have anything against renewable energy as long as it's not subsidised. I don't have anything against any form of energy really, as long as it's not subsidised. They should all compete with each other on a free market basis, unsubsidised, no special treatment, and that includes externalities, so they should pay for their externalities. So if they're causing pollution, and I have to say carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, but soot is, and you know, noxious gases are, then they should pay for those as well. So they should be inherent in their operating costs one way or another, or recovered in their operating costs. The problem we have with renewable energy all around the world, not just Australia, is it only exists because it's subsidised. You hear all this story about how it's now cost competitive with baseload fossil fuel power. It's not. If we took away the renewable energy target, the renewable energy scheme in Australia, in which the baseload, the coal-fired power stations subsidise the renewable energy generators, the renewable energy generators would all shut up shop. They wouldn't exist. And that's the problem. And because of that subsidy, what we're doing is keeping high-cost generators, leave aside the fact that they're unreliable, high-cost generators in business. It's raising the cost of electricity to everybody. When the cost of electricity goes up unnecessarily, that has adverse effects on the consumers of electricity, from consumers, personal consumers, low-income people, pensioners who can't afford to heat their house, people who go to shopping malls in the summertime to benefit from the air conditioning because they can't afford to air condition their homes, all that sort of stuff, through to industries which use electricity where it's a major input cost and driving up their costs. So as a result, they're uncompetitive. People lose their jobs, that sort of thing. So it's nothing against renewable energy in theory. It's just that in practice, it drives up energy costs because it has to be subsidised.
You created headlines when you called terrorist dickheads on the Q&A program the other night. You were particularly critical of the major parties who blame tech companies for breeding terrorism. Why are you so critical of the proposal to regulate tech companies, and what would you do instead to fix Islamic terrorism?
Well, what they were talking about was regulating the tech companies because Google and Facebook and probably the others, Twitter and the other social media platforms, because they were used by terrorists, and somehow or other it's their fault that the terrorists use them. Somehow or other the onus should be placed on those companies to stop the terrorists from using Islamists, from using those media for any purpose, certainly not to spread their message. That is, as I said on the Q&A program, no different from blaming a telephone company from the fact that a bunch of bank robbers are conspiring over the phone to rob a bank. It's a ridiculous transference of responsibility onto someone who isn't responsible. I think the bigger issue with this Islamist debate, if you like, and the discussion around it is the ways in which they can communicate their message, and ways in which they can convince people, impressionable people who are, have no roots in society and don't know what they believe in, and they're they're sort of looking for some sort of meaning in life. They're vulnerable, and somehow or other the Islamist message reaches them. Now, sometimes that is via social media, but it can also occur in a mosque or in a coffee shop or anywhere like that. So my preferred way of looking at that is to think of Islamism as a virus. And how do you deal with a virus? Well, you can vaccinate against it, you can quarantine against it, you can neutralise it with disinfectants of various kinds. So there's analogies from the virology theory in relation to Islamism that I think need to be taken seriously. What we also know is that that not everybody is equally likely to be promoting Islamism. Not everybody is likely to be acting on Islamism. Not everybody is at equal risk. If you are dealing with potentially dangerous chemicals, you have what's called a risk assessment. In fact, risk assessments are used in a whole lot of situations. Pretty familiar concept. Why can't you have a risk assessment approach taken to the prospect of terrorism from Islamists? Why is it that little old ladies with walking sticks are treated as just as important to screen as men, young men? Most of the terrorists, nearly all the terrorists in fact, are relatively young men, under 40. Why would you treat babies and mothers with babies as equally risky as young men? This approach, this risk assessment approach, would mean some people are of higher risk and some people are of lower risk. I have no doubt that the security agencies are perfectly capable of treating the risk of terrorism on the same basis as plenty of other agencies apply risk assessment approaches. I'll just check my notes there. There are various other aspects that I think are worth considering, and I'm not an expert on Islamic terrorism, but there's some fairly obvious things. One is when you have an Islamist who is contaminating, like a virus, contaminating the minds of impressionable people. This has been shown, at least in the UK, to occur in prisons at a much higher rate than in the general community. What can you do about it? You isolate them. That's what you do. It's called quarantining a virus. And you take all the people who believe in this ISIS propaganda or Al-Qaeda or any of the other nutcases, and you put them together so that they can talk to each other, but they can't talk to anybody else who doesn't subscribe to that point of view. So the virus can't go any further. That would seem to be a fairly obvious step. The other thing that's worth mentioning is the police depend on the support of the community, and that includes the Muslim community, to identify and deal with these terrorists and jump on them before they do anything dangerous, if that's what they're going to do. They can't do that. The police cannot be effective without the support of the community. So the risk assessment approach is important there. So you don't go and treat all Muslims, for example, as potential terrorists, because the Muslims themselves, most of them are not terrorists. In the UK, a survey proved that only about 4% of them had terrorist thoughts, terrorist inclinations. So you want everybody else in the Muslim community to help you pinpoint those people so they can be dealt with. And the police obviously need to have good relationships with the community. Now, that's not going to happen if they go running around the place in their black pyjamas and balaclavas and so forth, beating people over the head for no good reason. The only people they need to beat over the head are those who are in serious danger of harming other people. They need to have good relationships with the community. Running around booking people for speeding for a few Ks over the limit is not a formula for good community relationships between the police and or good community relationships with the police. There are many other things that the police do which are bumble-footed, block-headed, not very smart, that they need not do, and in the process damage relationships with the community. And we have to also remember that terrorists are pretty much all exclusively coming from the Sunni side of Islam, so that's not the Shiites, and they're also coming from the Salafist or Wahhabist strain of the Sunni side of Islam. That rules out an awful lot of Muslims, and if they're not from that side, then they're not in that risk group, then it may well be that they are our best friends at identifying these people and getting them out of harm's way. And of course, there's the other aspect that I raise in the general context of the community. If you are unable to defend yourself in practical terms, and you're defending on the police, you are a much more vulnerable, and we have a much more vulnerable society than if we are each individually regarded as the first responders. The first respond, somebody with self-defence means, such as pepper spray or mace or a firearm or something like that, wouldn't have made much difference in Manchester in England, but it could have made a difference in London. And the most recent attack, it took 8 minutes from when the police were called to when the terrorists were shot, which is very good. But in the meantime, 7 people were murdered. If somebody had been there, all it would have taken would have been one person, I suspect, who had had a gun. And it might have been an off-duty police officer, a plainclothes police officer, a security guard, someone from the military, someone who knows about guns, someone in a pistol club for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years who knows about guns, not just anybody. Just imagine what the outcome might have been if there had been somebody there with a gun, knew how to use it and had used it. There might have been lives saved. The same thing could have happened in the Lindt Cafe in Sydney. If one of those people in that cafe had a gun, suppose they'd been one of Malcolm Turnbull's bodyguards. They all wear suits, you can't tell who they are. They've all got a gun under their arm. Suppose one of them had been sitting in there having a cup of coffee and Monis had taken them all hostage. The outcome could have been dramatically different and lives could have been saved. So there are some things that can be done, but in terms of the bigger picture, identifying them, dealing with them on a national and international basis, I have to say I'm not an expert. I've just had a few ideas on how things could be improved.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a couple of Facebook questions from Levi and Maxwell, which are fairly similar, so I've joined them together. What is your solution to the refugees on Nauru and Manus Island? And can you outline the LDP immigration policy in relation to this issue?
Yeah, we probably don't have enough time to outline the whole of our immigration policy. But first of all, we believe in free immigration agreements. So that means a relationship like we have with New Zealand, where New Zealanders can live in Australia, Australians can live in New Zealand, work, pay tax, no restrictions. We think there are more countries where we could do that. Canada, for example, maybe the UK, maybe Sweden, Japan, places like that. So that's first point. Second point is We think at the moment the bureaucrats are choosing which occupations we need and assigning points to them. So people who want to migrate to Australia have to qualify via this point system. It depends on bureaucrats getting it right. We think a better approach would be to make it market-based, so they pay a fee, they can get permanent residence, and if they pay the fee, they can come here and work and get permanent residence. However, that's also subject to not receiving welfare. The only people who should be able to get welfare are citizens or people here allowed into the country on compassionate grounds, basically refugees. So any intending migrant would have to decide whether it's worth paying the fee, because if they couldn't work or they couldn't support themselves, they didn't have family who were going to support them, then they would be on their own because they wouldn't get welfare. So that's they're the two main elements of our immigration policy. The other one is, I think Australia is a wealthy country, has a history of accepting migrants. We should accept refugees who've got nowhere else to go. Now, what kind of people have got nowhere else to go? Well, there are quite a lot, but I think Christians from the Middle East, for example, they've got no other country they can go to. We should be preferring them over Muslims, for example, who have got other countries they can go to. Whether Sunni or Shiite, there are other countries that they can go and live in safely, get away from the dangerous environment from which they're leaving from, and settle in those countries. Christians from the Middle East, they're being persecuted in every single Middle Eastern country. They've got nowhere else to go, really, if they don't get well and truly away from that place. And so I would be giving them priority. And I have argued in the past with the Immigration Minister for an increase in our refugee intake. It's up to about, what, 14,000 or something like that. It's not a lot, but we are a generous country, and I think our refugee intake should reflect our generosity.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Senator David Leyonhjelm, for spending some time with us and going over some of those questions that weren't covered in enough detail on Monday's Q&A. Thank you.